Vincent, Vince Malone, the man whose name once silenced conversations in Liverpool's darkest corners, and Reid, the mysterious outsider whose arrival promised fortune but delivered betrayal. One built an empire on fear. The other dismantled it with a single, calculated move. This is the story of how the city's most terrifying gangster met his end, not at the hands of the law, but through the cold precision of someone he trusted most. In the late 1990s, Liverpool was a city caught in a storm of change. The old docks had closed, industries had vanished, and in their place came a darker economy built on crime. Street corners became meeting points for drug runners, and certain pubs turned into places where deals were made instead of drinks enjoyed. It was during this time of uncertainty and fear that Vince Malone first began making his name. At 17, he was already known to the police for petty thefts, break-ins, and selling stolen goods. But Vince was different from the other small-time troublemakers in his neighborhood. He was calculating, patient, and willing to wait for the perfect moment to move from petty crime into something far more dangerous. His early years were spent watching how the city's older gangsters operated. He noticed who survived and who didn't, who the police chased and who they seemed to ignore. By his early 20s, Vince had built connections with black market traders who dealt in more than just knockoff clothes or stolen electronics. Through them, he found his way into the drug trade, starting small with cannabis before expanding into harder substances. Every move he made was measured. He never carried drugs himself, always using others to handle the risk. He avoided flashy cars and expensive clothes that might draw police attention. His ambition was simple: control, not fame. It was this quiet but ruthless approach that helped him rise so quickly. Within a few years, Vince was no longer the boy running errands for bigger criminals. He was the man giving orders. His territory began to spread beyond his home streets, reaching into the heart of Liverpool's night economy. He positioned himself in control of clubs, bars, and even security companies that acted as fronts for his real business. Those who worked for him knew the rules. Loyalty was rewarded generously, but betrayal was punished in ways that left lasting scars. If the traitor survived at all, Vince understood the power of fear better than anyone. He knew that violence, when used sparingly and publicly, could do more than endless threats whispered in the dark. When one rival tried to undercut his prices, the man's car was found burned out in broad daylight, right outside his own home. No one needed to be told who was ended, and no one dared to make the same mistake again. By the turn of the millennium, Vince Malone's name was spoken quietly, almost like a curse. Parents told their children to avoid him, and grown men avoided eye contact if he passed them on the street. His influence was everywhere but invisible. No paperwork or photographs tied him to the crimes he controlled. It was this mix of cunning, caution, and calculated brutality that made him not just another street thug, but a figure who seemed untouchable. For the police, he was a ghost they could never quite catch. For the people of Liverpool, he was the shadow that loomed over the city's darkest corner. By the early 2000s, Vince Malone had transformed from a shadowy street figure into the architect of a criminal empire. What began with small deals in back alleys had grown into a network that touched nearly every corner of Liverpool. He had men on the docks, controlling shipments before they ever reached official hands. He had eyes inside warehouses, ensuring stolen goods were moved quickly and discreetly. His influence reached into the city's nightlife, where his crew ran door security at popular clubs, allowing drugs to flow freely inside while the owners pretended not to notice. Vince's empire was built on three pillars: drugs, money laundering, and fear. The drugs brought in vast profits, and those profits had to be cleaned. To outsiders, Vince appeared to own several legitimate businesses: a chain of used car dealerships, a construction firm that never seemed to build anything, and a small import company dealing in specialty goods. These businesses existed for one reason: to turn illegal cash into clean, taxable income. On paper, he was a wealthy entrepreneur. In reality, every pound was stained with blood and intimidation. What set Vince apart from other gang leaders was his ability to make people feel both indebted and afraid. He would lend money to struggling pub owners, only to demand repayment in favors instead of cash. These favors could be anything: storing illegal shipments, passing on information about police movements, or turning a blind eye when his men needed a place to hide. Over time, these arrangements created an unbreakable web of obligation. People who once thought they were just doing a small favor for Vince found themselves trapped, unable to say no without risking their safety. His control was so tight that even those who hated him worked under his rules. Rival dealers knew that moving product without Vince's approval was a death sentence. If someone was foolish enough to try, they were dealt with in a way that would leave the entire community in shock. One dealer was found beaten and left in an alley, his injuries so severe he could never walk properly again. The message was clear: Vince didn't need to kill to destroy you. At the height of his power, Vince's monthly earnings were rumored to be in the hundreds of thousands of pounds. He never carried large sums himself, never touched drugs directly, and never left a paper trail. Instead, he let his lieutenants handle the risky parts while he focused on strategy. He knew which police officers could be bribed and which ones needed to be avoided entirely. He knew the names of every informant who had ever worked against him, and more importantly, how to make their lives unbearable. To the outside world, Vince Malone was just another successful businessman. But inside the underworld, he was the ruler of a city's shadows. Every deal, every threat, every whispered order ran through him, and while some men built their empires on trust, Vince built his on something far stronger: the certainty that crossing him meant your life, as you knew it, was over. In 2007, Vince Malone's empire showed its first visible sign of weakness, though few at the time realized how dangerous it would become for him. It began with a shipment of cocaine worth close to £1 million. The cargo was supposed to arrive through a trusted channel, hidden inside containers coming off the docks under the watch of men Vince had paid and threatened into loyalty. For years the system had worked flawlessly. This time, however, the drugs vanished before they ever reached his warehouse. The disappearance was more than just a financial loss, it was a challenge to his control. Vince reacted in the way everyone expected: swiftly and brutally. The man in charge of overseeing the shipment was dragged from his home in the early hours, bundled into a van, and never seen alive again. Days later, his body was found in the River Mersey, his hands bound and weighted. The killing sent a shockwave through the underworld, a reminder that Vince dealt with problems without hesitation. Yet despite the example made of the man, the truth remained: someone had dared to take from him, and they had gotten away with it. Whispers began to spread among rival crews and even within Vince's own ranks. Some claimed the missing drugs had been intercepted by police. Others suggested it was the work of a rival gang from Manchester looking to test Vince's reach. But the most dangerous rumor was the one Vince couldn't ignore: that someone close to him had orchestrated the theft. Loyalty had always been his weapon, and the idea that a trusted associate might have turned against him planted a seed of paranoia. The police, who had spent years trying and failing to dismantle Vince's organization, took notice. Detectives monitoring his movements began to see small but significant changes. Vince, normally calm and calculated, started holding more private meetings in secluded locations. He changed his routine, altered his routes, and ordered background checks on his own crew. These cracks in his usually perfect armor gave law enforcement a rare insight into his vulnerabilities. Behind the scenes, the cocaine theft had triggered more than suspicion. It disrupted Vince's cash flow at a critical time. Several large deals had been lined up with buyers expecting the shipment, and its absence meant delayed payments and growing tension among his business partners. Some began to doubt whether Vince could still guarantee the security he once promised. Those doubts were dangerous. In the criminal world, a moment of perceived weakness could invite challengers. For the first time in nearly a decade, Vince Malone wasn't in complete control. The missing shipment had damaged more than his profits. It had damaged his reputation. He knew that if he didn't find out who was behind it and crush them publicly, the fear that kept his empire standing would begin to fade. And in the shadows of Liverpool's streets, rivals were already watching closely, waiting for the right moment to strike. That winter, when the city's nights were long and the streets stayed slick with cold rain, a man named Reid arrived in Liverpool. No one seemed to know much about him, only that he came from London and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had been in the game for years. He dressed well, but not in a way that drew too much attention, spoke with an easy charm, and had a way of making even the most suspicious men feel at ease. For Vince Malone, who was still dealing with the fallout from the missing cocaine shipment, Reid's arrival came at a strangely opportune time. Reid presented himself as a businessman looking to expand into Liverpool. He claimed he could move large amounts of product into London quickly and without risk, using routes he had personally established through the capital. Vince, always cautious, ran quiet checks on the newcomer. The results were clean enough to convince him: no obvious ties to police, no reputation for trouble, and a track record of moving goods in London without attracting unwanted attention. To Vince, Reid seemed like a man worth knowing, someone who could help restore the flow of cash and strengthen his influence beyond Merseyside. What Vince didn't know was that Reid's story was only half true. He had indeed operated in London, but in recent years he had been working closely with a powerful Manchester crew who had been watching Vince's rise for a long time. To them, Vince represented a threat and an opportunity. If they could dismantle his operation and take control of his territory, their grip on the northwest drug trade would become unshakable. Reid's mission was clear: get close to Vince, feed his rivals the information they needed, and position himself so that when the time came, Vince's empire could be taken apart from within. Reid's charm made the job easier than expected. He bought drinks for the right people, tipped generously, and always made sure word of his connections in London reached the ears of those who mattered. Soon, he was being invited into the inner circles of Vince's world: private meetings, warehouse inspections, and closed-door strategy discussions. He learned where Vince stored his product, which men he trusted most, and which clubs acted as central points for money laundering. The Manchester crew, receiving regular updates from Reid, began quietly working in the background. They intercepted smaller shipments to test Vince's response, paid off minor players in his organization, and subtly increased tensions between his lieutenants. Reid's reports painted a clear picture of a man still powerful but slowly becoming surrounded by problems too large to ignore. To Vince, Reid seemed like the rare kind of ally who could be trusted in a world full of liars and opportunists. But to Reid, every handshake, every conversation, and every shared drink was another step toward the day Vince Malone's rule over Liverpool would come to a violent and calculated end. The trap was being set, and Vince didn't even realize he was already standing in the middle of it. In 2010, Liverpool's bustling city centre became the stage for an event that would send shockwaves through the underworld. It happened on a Friday evening, when Bold Street was alive with the sound of traffic, the chatter of shoppers, and the glow of cafe lights spilling onto the pavement. The air was cold but dry, and the street was unusually busy for the time of year. Among the crowd was one of Vince Malone's most trusted men, Carl Dwyer, a figure as feared as he was loyal. He had been at Vince's side for more than a decade, serving as an enforcer, negotiator, and protector. To those who knew the criminal world, Carl's presence on the street was as good as a warning to stay away. But that night, Carl was not the one sending the message. He was about to receive one. Without warning, two masked men on a motorbike tore down Bold Street. Witnesses would later describe the sound of the engine revving hard, the blur of black clothing, and then the sharp cracks of gunfire that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Carl was hit multiple times before he even had the chance to react. He collapsed on the pavement, the bright neon from nearby shop signs reflecting in the pool of blood spreading beneath him. The attack lasted less than 30 seconds, but its impact would be felt for years. The shooters sped away, weaving through traffic before disappearing into the warren of side streets leading toward the docks. Panic swept the crowd. People screamed, ducked for cover, and ran into nearby shops. Within minutes, police had cordoned off the area, but the killers were already gone. For Vince Malone, the killing was more than a personal loss. Carl had been his right hand, the man who enforced his rules without hesitation. To kill him so publicly, on one of the city's busiest streets, was a deliberate act meant to humiliate Vince and show the world that his power could be challenged. The fact that it happened in broad daylight, in front of dozens of witnesses, suggested the attackers were confident there would be no immediate consequences. What Vince didn't yet know was that the attack had been engineered with precision by Reid. Months of quiet manipulation had built a false narrative that Carl was planning to break away and start his own operation. This rumor was fed to both Vince's enemies and his allies, creating tension on all sides. Reid had then provided key details of Carl's movements to the Manchester crew, ensuring they could strike when and where it would hurt Vince the most. In the aftermath, fear rippled through Vince's organization. Men who had once felt safe under his protection now questioned whether he could keep them alive. Rivals sensed the shift and began probing for weaknesses. Vince responded with his usual ferocity, but the damage was already done. Bold Street had become more than just a crime scene. It was a statement, written in gunfire, that the untouchable Vince Malone was no longer beyond reach. Detectives had been chasing Vince Malone for over a decade, watching his empire grow from small-time drug deals into a multi-million-pound network that stretched beyond Liverpool. They had seen countless operations fail to catch him, raids on warehouses that turned up empty, surveillance that led nowhere, witnesses who suddenly changed their stories. Vince was too careful, too disciplined, and too feared. But after the Bold Street shooting, everything changed. The chaos inside his organization gave the police an opening they had never had before. The murder of Carl Dwyer had not only rattled Vince's crew but it also disrupted his carefully controlled operations. Shipments were delayed, meetings were cancelled, and some of his men were making desperate, sloppy decisions to protect themselves. This instability gave detectives new trails to follow. They began quietly targeting Vince's lower-level associates, offering reduced charges in exchange for information. Most refused out of fear, but the pressure was building. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected place, a young nightclub worker named Jason Lowe. Jason had been on the payroll of one of Vince's nightclubs for almost 2 years, mainly as a DJ and occasional event organizer. He wasn't a gangster, but working in that environment meant hearing things he shouldn't have. One night, while closing up after an event, he had overheard Vince and 2 lieutenants discussing the arrival of a shipment coming in through the docks. Jason didn't think much of it at the time, but after Carl's murder and a police raid on a neighboring club, he began to fear he was already too close to the violence. When detectives approached Jason under the guise of a routine inquiry, his nervousness gave him away. Within days, he agreed to cooperate, providing details of the shipment, the warehouse it was headed to, and even the vehicles that would be used to move it. For the first time, police had reliable, first-hand intelligence from inside Vince's network. Armed with this information, they began building a case. Surveillance teams tracked the shipment from the docks to the warehouse. Hidden cameras were installed, and financial investigators traced payments flowing through Vince's businesses. Every new piece of evidence strengthened the case, but the detectives knew they had to move carefully. Vince had friends in unexpected places, and any hint that he was being cornered could make him disappear. Meanwhile, Vince's paranoia was growing. He knew someone had been talking, a leak somewhere in his chain of trust, but he couldn't pinpoint who it was. He started rotating his crew on different jobs, changing meeting spots, and conducting surprise checks on his own men. The tighter he tried to grip his operation, the more cracks began to appear. By late 2011, police believed they had enough to arrest him, but they wanted more. Something undeniable, something that would end his reign completely. They didn't yet know that fate, in the form of Reid's final betrayal, would soon hand them exactly what they were waiting for. In the early months of 2012, Vince Malone believed he was on the verge of rebuilding the strength he had lost. The cracks in his empire were still there, but the panic following Carl Dwyer's death had begun to settle. Money was flowing again, smaller rivals had been pushed back into line, and a promising new deal loomed on the horizon. That deal came from Reid, the man Vince had come to view as one of his most reliable allies. Reid spoke of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a bulk shipment of high-purity cocaine from South America, already secured and waiting to be moved. The profit margin was extraordinary, enough to remind Liverpool who truly ruled its streets. Reid insisted the deal had to be handled discreetly. No big crews, no open discussions, just a small, trusted meeting to finalize terms before the product arrived. Vince, who valued control above all else, liked the idea of keeping it quiet. He chose only 2 of his most loyal men to accompany him. The meeting was set for a deserted warehouse on the outskirts of the city, far from prying eyes. The night was cold and damp, with mist creeping across the empty industrial estate. Vince's black SUV rolled slowly up to the warehouse, headlights cutting through the gloom. Inside, the place was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of oil and dust. Reid was there, standing beside a metal table with a folder and a half-empty bottle of whiskey. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place, but Vince, always alert to danger, noticed the tension in Reid's posture, the way his eyes shifted toward the shadows in the far corners of the building. Before Vince could react, figures emerged from the darkness. Men armed with shotguns and pistols, their faces hidden behind balaclavas. They weren't there to negotiate. The Manchester crew had arrived, and the trap was sprung. In that instant, Vince realized what had happened. Reid hadn't brought him to secure a deal, he had brought him to be destroyed. The first shots shattered the silence. Vince's men returned fire, the echoes ricocheting off the concrete walls. The air filled with smoke, gunpowder, and shouted commands. Vince was hit in the leg early on but kept firing, trying to reach the exit. His 2 men went down quickly, one collapsing beside a stack of wooden pallets, the other slumping against the wall. It was over in minutes. Vince took 2 bullets to the chest, falling hard to the cold floor. He was still breathing when the shooters vanished into the night, leaving Reid standing over him for a moment before slipping away into the shadows. By the time police, acting on an anonymous tip-off, stormed the warehouse, the scene was silent except for the drip of water from a leaking pipe. Vince was barely alive, his breathing shallow and ragged. He died on the way to the hospital. The man who had ruled Liverpool's streets brought down not by the law, but by the betrayal of the one person he had allowed closest to him. In the weeks following Vince Malone's death, Liverpool's criminal underworld shifted at a speed that surprised even the most seasoned figures in the game. The man who had once been the unchallenged ruler of the city's shadows was gone, and with him went the fear that had held the streets in check for over a decade. His death at the warehouse was more than just the end of one man's reign. It was the signal for a complete restructuring of power. Rival crews, some from within Liverpool and others from Manchester and beyond, moved quickly to claim pieces of his territory. The businesses Vince had used as fronts were either taken over or abandoned, their staff suddenly free from the unspoken rules that had governed them for years. Police seized the opportunity with both hands. In the immediate aftermath, they launched a series of raids across the city, targeting safe houses, warehouses, and properties linked to Vince's organization. Several of his remaining lieutenants were arrested, their assets frozen before they could transfer money or flee abroad. Evidence gathered in the months before Vince's death, combined with the chaos after, allowed detectives to close multiple cases that had been stagnant for years. Drugs, weapons, and large amounts of cash were taken off the streets, but the victories for law enforcement came with an unspoken truth. The vacuum left by Vince's fall would not remain empty for long. For those who had lived under his shadow, reactions were mixed. Some breathed a quiet sigh of relief, feeling for the first time in years that they could go about their lives without fear of crossing the wrong person. Shopkeepers who had been paying protection money stopped looking over their shoulders. Club owners who had been forced into business arrangements with Vince could now run their venues without his men lurking by the doors. But there were also those who mourned him, not out of loyalty, but because Vince's rule, as ruthless as it had been, had also brought a certain order to the city's criminal economy. Without him, smaller, more unpredictable players were free to act, and disputes were settled with sudden, reckless violence. Reid, the architect of Vince's downfall, vanished without a trace. In the months that followed, there were rumors of him resurfacing in Spain, then in Dubai, each story less certain than the last. To some, he was a ghost who had cashed in his betrayal for a ticket to a quiet life, far from the streets he had manipulated. To others, he was simply biding his time, waiting to return when the dust had settled. Years later, Vince Malone's name was still spoken in Liverpool, often in hushed tones, more legend than memory. To the older generation, he was a reminder of how absolute power could grow from the smallest beginnings. To the younger ones, his story was a cautionary tale. Proof that no matter how feared, how connected, or how careful a man might be, there was always someone willing to wait for the perfect moment to strike. And when that moment came, even the most terrifying gangster could fall in a single night.